The Trump folks are out of military options. Unless they completely reverse course, and they won't do this before the election.
My guest is Professor Scott Lucas, a highly experienced and globally renowned expert in American politics, US and British foreign policy, and a wide range of international affairs.
The Strait of Hormuz issue, though, if you could start with that, the actual situation has gotten even worse regarding passage. On Tuesday, there was a total of between 8 and 11 vessels crossed. The normal traffic through the strait before the U.S.-Israel war was 135 ships per day.
With specific focus on the Middle East, Iran, Europe, and Asia, he also has expertise in the new media, intelligence services, and propaganda.
The other big development is a defense pact between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, which is if one of us gets attacked, we defend each other. We're getting a decentring of the region. And the Trump folks are not geared up for that. And in fact, they still think they can go into Gaza and they can have these economic projects. They can have these condos. They can have this high-end property in the Israeli-controlled space of Gaza. And they could have those projects for resorts and golf courses up in the Gulf. And it's like, you think that's going to happen now?
He has also been an active journalist since 1979 and is the founder and editor-in-chief of EA Worldview, a prominent news site that provides daily news and analysis of global affairs.
But then there's the layer on top of this, which you picked up on immediately because you're good at this stuff, right? Which is...
Just found out that over 93% of you who regularly listen to our podcast and watch us on YouTube are not subscribed. So please do me a massive favor and make sure that you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so we can stay connected and stay informed every time we upload a new video. This will make a massive difference to help us with our mission to inform as many people as we possibly can and save them from the clickbait shadows once and for all. And I promise you, I will make sure that we'll continue growing, we'll continue holding everybody to account. We're not taking any sides, we're taking the sides of facts, science, and real data. Welcome everybody to our bi-weekly geopolitics review with the one and only Scott Lucas. How are you doing, my friend?
Well, I'm a lot cooler than you are, so that's the start. You're the one that got the heat wave going on in London. Whereas here, we're sitting around about 20 degrees, or in olden U.S. terms, around about 68. And I'm like, yeah, this is fine. So I'll let you sweat a bit while I'll just sit here.
Well, I made myself homemade iced coffee right here. Like, so it's melted already. It's like there's no ice left. Yeah, this is our fifth heat wave. And for those people who live outside the UK, this is our fifth heat wave in 2 months. And every heat wave is hotter than the previous one. And it's basically breaking all-time records. And it really kind of, I guess, reemphasizes the discussion that I had with Steve Keen in the last episode. I know you watched some of it as well. That really we're not taking the climate change situation seriously enough. And I had also a few comments in that video where people just dismissing it. They say, look, man, this is just one of those cycles that happen every few thousand years or whatever. I'm like, whatever that keeps you, I don't want to say ignorant, but is, comfortable or try to delude yourself that somehow it will pass. But this is a serious problem.
Of course it is. This is where it helps be an old guy that remember that back in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan had an interior secretary named James Watt, who was an evangelical Christian, and he believed in the apocalypse. So effectively the theory was, if the planet burns up, we're all going to heaven anyway, or at least his kind were. So why drag it out? It's like, here we are.
Right, it's all down, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. 40 years later. And again, I speak as someone whose sister is an apocalyptic evangelical, so I still have to live with this a bit.
Wow. It's bizarre. I mean, because it's serious. I mean, I think, Britain is infamously the rainy country, one of the wettest countries in the world. We had no rain for several weeks. I mean, it's officially a drought period in the UK. We have bushfires now, which is something that we've never had before. There's a COBRA meeting at the time of the recording of this episode where the government's trying now to figure out how do we manage water supply, how do we manage food supply, because farmers basically lost all of their crops. Literally everything that Steve Keen said in the last episode is happening a week later, And and this is the problem, and I think it's really linked nicely to what we always talk about on this channel with you. But it's like right now the situation in Iran, somehow it's even worse than it's ever been. I mean, we thought somehow it will resolve itself eventually because that common sense, or well, not even common sense, but reality will bite Trump in the ass eventually. But somehow he still managed to make it even worse. How?
Yeah. All right. Well, strap in, because first of all, we're in a really hard period for this, because quite often when the media covers a war, it's like, okay, it's relatively easy to cover a war. It's horrible, but it's relatively easy to cover a war when there's attacks going on all over the place, because then you get like your headlines and this has been blown up, this has been destroyed. And of course, we had that in the initial phase when you had the targeted assassinations and the extensive bombing across Iran. And then you had Iran's retaliation, on the Gulf states, and then taking control of the Strait of Hormuz. Then it's kind of, you've got news as well when you get into like a period where you might think it's going to end, which was the period we had in the spring where we had the ceasefire and then the memorandum of understanding, where it's really hard for media, first of all, to keep its eye on what's happening because it gets a little bit complicated. And secondly, to keep like people engaged with it is when you've got neither war nor the prospect of peace breaking out. And that's where we are right now. And so I almost have to layer this to talk about it. Look, you always have to say, all right, well, where's the focal issue out of all this? And the focal issue still is the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it's that waterway, 20 to 25% of the world's maritime oil and gas going through it. And it's still bottled up in that, hundreds of vessels.
And so we should also add Bab El-Mandeb now. This is now the second strait, which is on the Red Sea. That's joined the equation this week as well.
Yeah. And I will add that on top in just a second, right? Because you're absolutely right. The Bab El-Mandeb Strait, which is the one which is to the south of the Arabian Peninsula, connecting the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The Strait of Hormuz issue, though, if you could start with that, is that the actual situation has gotten even worse regarding passage. I think we're recording on a Wednesday. On Tuesday, there was a total of, and it depends which monitor you're talking about, but between 8 and 11 vessels crossed. And that was the lowest number that we'd had in the past 10 days. To give you a comparison, the normal traffic through the strait before the U.S.-Israel war was 135 ships per day. So 8 to 11, right? And in the middle of this, just to show you how ludicrous this gets, especially coming out of Washington. I mean, both sides, by the way, Iranian regime and Trump folks, both are going to put out their spin, their PR, their misinformation. But in this case, it was the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who says, "Oh, we got 9 billion barrels of oil out of the strait." And everyone, did you get, the normal traffic through the strait is around about 20 million barrels of oil per day. And you say you got 9 billion barrels of oil per day out there when only like 8 to 11 ships passed. And those aren't oil tankers. In fact, I think only 2 of them were. So, the Trump folks are lying about this, just as when Trump says, "Oh, we have control of the strait." And then in the very next sentence says, "Oh, well, we're going to have to be really tough in talks about the strait." It's like, well, if you control it, why do you even think you have to talk about it? So you cut through all of that. And where are we with the Strait of Hormuz? Well, Iran's talking to Oman. Still talking to Oman, which is the Gulf state to the south of the strait. Talks have been going on for a few weeks because they're trying to hammer out the details of this. Now, I think both sides have got the general lines set up, which is Iran will control entry into the strait, which is the northern route along their coast. The southern route along the Omani coast will be the exit route. And Oman will oversee that, but in consultation with the Iranians. There's still discussions about whether they're going to charge fees, though, and how they'll frame that, because Iran can't call it a toll. Gulf states won't allow it to be called a toll. And they're trying to work all of that out. They're trying to make sure they have the other Gulf states on board. The Pakistanis are the mediator, that you want them on board as well. And then you present the Trump folks with a done deal, which is like, okay, guys, you need to come back to the table and accept this. The broader picture of this is, however, that the Trump folks are out of military options. Unless they completely reverse course, and they won't do this before the election. Guarantee it won't happen before the election. Unless they completely reverse course and put in ground troops, they've got no military options left. And this goes back almost 2 weeks when they had the Camp David meeting, the retreat outside Washington, and the military told them, you haven't got enough air defense interceptors, so you can't protect against Iranian retaliation. And that means Gulf state partners. That means Jordan. It means the Israelis. And you don't have enough offensive missiles to expand more broadly. And even if you expand, you've hit all the military targets. You're talking about expanding to civilian infrastructure, which raises real questions about like war crimes. You add on top of that the spike in oil and gas prices that would take place if you went back to the war. You add the fact that more than 70% of Americans are opposed to the war now, that some in the administration, like Uncle JD, the vice president's opposed to it. So they don't have the military option. So their only option, because they cannot break Iran hold on the Strait of Hormuz, they just can't, is they've got to come back into talks. But then the question is, do they come back into talks on the basis of the memorandum of understanding, which was in June? And the problem here is that Trump signed them up to all kinds of commitments when he signed the memorandum of understanding without consulting his senior advisors. But he kind of locked them in. And the commitments were not only Iran gets to manage the Strait of Hormuz in conjunction with Oman, but if Iran opens up the waterway, then the U.S. lifts its sanctions on Iran. The U.S. accepts the unfreezing of some of Iranian frozen assets abroad, and there are up to $100 billion of frozen assets out there. And there is even a clause in the memorandum of understanding for this investment and reconstruction fund, which in principle, up to $300 billion. In practice, it's more tricky because Trump doesn't want to give a single penny to it, and he was hoping the Gulf states would finance it. But look, he signed the Americans up to this, right? So now, if you go back to the negotiating table, do you go back into that, right? And I think the answer is no, the Trump folks don't want to go back into that. So they're trying to walk away and say, okay, maybe we'll go back to talks, but we'll go back almost to a square one position. Now, square one position, the Iranians aren't going to accept that, because why should they give up what they had back in June, including, by the way, an American acceptance, it appears, that they could continue to enrich uranium, albeit to a lower level than now. Why should they give that up, given that the Americans don't have any leverage now that they didn't have in June? In other words, the Americans don't have the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans don't look like they can make the regime surrender. The Iranian economy is a shambles, but it's not like it's going to completely collapse immediately. Yeah. So I think what the Trump folks are trying to do now is like they're praying somehow that the Iranian economy just goes completely belly up before the U.S. elections, right? And if the economy doesn't go belly up before the elections, they're playing the clock out, where even if there are messages that are exchanged between them and the Iranians, they will not go back into meaningful talks until after November. And they're praying that the American public will accept that, right? Because, the idea is, we know that if they go back to war, more than 70% of Americans oppose that. Can they get away with this idea of, all right, we haven't gone back to war. Your gas prices haven't gone completely haywire, gasoline prices, because they're still just above $4 a gallon for regular unleaded, and they had gotten as high as $4.50 earlier in this. Will the American public wear that? In other words, can they sort of just simply tread water on the economy and maybe hold on to control of I don't think they can control both houses of Congress, but maybe they can hold on to the Senate. So now, if that's what they're calculating, and that, by the way, prevents the split within the administration between those who want to go back to war and those who don't. If that's what they're calculating, and if they get away with it, you and I are going to come back in mid-November and be discussing this same issue. Are we going back to war or are we going back to meaningful talks? Now, sorry, and I apologize for spinning all this out. But then there's the layer on top of this, which you picked up on immediately because you're good at this stuff, right? Which is, it's not just about the U.S. and Iran, right? There is the Israel-Lebanon front, which people, again, it's difficult for the media to cover it because it's not like all-out war where we were earlier, where the Israelis were not only hitting the south, they were going all the way and bombing Beirut as well. But it's not quite a settlement, even though there's a nominal ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. And that's because the Israelis, who are trying to occupy, that area of southern Lebanon along the border, going up probably, at least 10 kilometers deep, they are demolishing houses to displace people. So more than 200,000 Lebanese at least going to be displaced. This morning's story I wrote up was on that they are burning forest and other grassland. So it's just basically a burn policy. The pretense is, Hezbollah can hide in the forest. So now the Israelis are literally carrying out that mantra from 1968 in Vietnam, that, U.S. officer who says, what is to save this village or to save this town, we had to burn it down, right? That's what the Israelis are literally doing right now in southern Lebanon. So that is something to keep an eye on. Remember, down in Gaza, they have trashed the agreement from last October for the ceasefire. The ceasefire agreement last October, they were supposed to get 53% of Gaza up to the yellow line. They've gone beyond the yellow line now, and they hold between 65 and 70% of Gaza, and they're attacking the other 30%. So we're getting close to 1,300 people that have been killed in Gaza since the ceasefire was imposed. So you got Gaza, and there's all kinds of violence going on in the West Bank because, at a minimum, the settlers, who effectively are being allowed to expand their areas in the West Bank, they're going in to intimidate Palestinian people in Palestinian towns and villages. And these armed settlers are kicking off all types of violence that takes place. All right. And the Israeli military will not hold them back, it appears at this point. So, by the way, the story on that town, and get your head around this today, rather than holding the settlers back because they've surrounded a Palestinian home, right, threatening to kill those who are inside, rather than pulling those settlers back, the Israeli military are trying to evacuate the family inside, move them out of their home. All of that's going on the Israel-Lebanon front. And then the front, which is really, if you've got eyes open, you're watching it, it is what's happening in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So Yemen, this country that's split between the internationally recognized government, but in fact, that government is really a Saudi-backed government. So the Saudis are the big players there. And then you have the Houthis, who actually control most of the country, and they're backed by the Iranians. The Houthis had kept their heads down for months, right? And they put them up a few weeks ago. And whether they put their heads up because the Iranians said it's go time, or whether the Houthis went to Iran and say, we would like to do this, and the Iranians accepted, or the Houthis just decided to do it. But it happened very soon after a Houthi delegation was in Tehran for the Supreme Leader's funeral. And then what happened that spiraled all of this is that the Saudis, nominally the Yemeni government, but the Saudis tried to prevent the Houthis from getting back into the capital on this Iranian plane. And they tried to close down Yemeni airspace. And the Houthis said, well, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do now is we're going to blockade the Saudi ports. Now, Saudi Arabia has, of course, faces to the east, right, which you could talk about, but it faces to the west on the Red Sea.
Yes.
And so what the Houthis were doing is, we're going to blockade your ports, which also means any ships coming out of Saudi ports that want to come through the Bab El-Mandeb Strait, which is we're going to target them. And they have fired on a number of ships. Some of those ships had to turn back to Saudi ports. The ships that are allowed, by the way, the ships that can go to Saudi ports and get through the Bab El-Mandeb Strait, there is an exception to this rule. Which country do you think they are from? Who
Oh,
who
Iran,
the Houthis like? No, because the Iranians don't really have shipping on that part of Saudi, right? The Iranians run all their ships through the Strait. It's a big country. It's a very big country. It's China, right?
Well, of course, yes.
The Chinese, so the Houthis want to keep China happy, so Chinese tankers can still come out, right, off the Saudi coast. But if you're not Chinese tankers, no. Now, this has expanded in recent days, both in terms of that the Saudis, either themselves or by working with the Iraq militias in Iraq, who also are linked to Iran, have fired on Saudi ports, right? And the Saudis have fired on, Yemen. And now inside Yemen, there was a serious incident a few days ago where the Houthis fired on government military camps, Saudi-backed camps, killed about 58 fighters. So it was pretty high toll. And those attacks are continuing between the Saudi-backed military group and the Houthis. That could go, you don't know how far that could escalate, right? So the thing is that the Trump folks aren't even looking at that, because they're looking at the fact that they've got this mess going on with Iran. The Saudi, but where it reframes, it makes you recalculate. It's like, where are the Gulf states when you link all those issues up? And I think what we're really talking about here is the signals you need to watch is if the Trump folks will not come back and negotiate on the basis of the memorandum of understanding, will the Saudis come out and call them out on it? Will they call them out? Because an additional reason why the Americans did not, the Trump camp, why they did not expand the airstrikes inside Iran when they had that emergency meeting effectively a couple of weeks ago was because the Saudi leader, Mohammed bin Salman, got on the phone with Trump and said, we don't support this. And when he said we don't support this, he was speaking probably on behalf of other Gulf states. And the reason why they don't support it is they don't think the Americans can finish, they don't think the Trump folks can finish the job and get rid of the regime. So it means the regime is still in power and are still able to retaliate against the Gulf states. Now the Saudis also face the fact that they've got this complication with the Houthis down in Yemen. Now, unless the Saudis think they can finish off the Houthis, which I don't think they can, it's like they need to get out of this. But I think the way they do it, and I'm just gaming this out, I'm not guaranteeing this, Will, is that it'll come through Pakistan. If Pakistan escalates the rhetoric, calling for the talks to restart on the basis of the memorandum, that's the Saudis. That's the Saudis through Pakistan that are doing it. Saudis are well behind Pakistan. And by the way, you want an inside tip how to recognize all of this? The Al Arabiya, which is the Saudi state television outlet.
Yes.
And they have and they have an English channel, and I'm on that channel, right? So there's always a clue as to whether they're upset with the Trump folks. And that is when they come to me to go on the channel, they're upset with the Trump folks because they know as an analyst, I'm not sympathetic to Trump. When they go back to the Trumpist, and there's a couple of them who are currently on there, and when they go back to the Trumpist who put out Trump nonsense, then the Saudis are okay with that, right? Well, I'm waiting to see if I get a phone call from Al Arabiya in the next 24, 48 hours, which will signal how they're distancing from the United States. But here's the other signal, which is, it's just great. It's Pakistan TV, because Pakistan TV in recent days, because I'm waiting to go on there and I'm on Pakistan TV quite often. And the bit that before that is all about how great the Saudis are, right? Yeah, the Saudis are brilliant. We love the Saudis. Yeah, and it's like, yeah, okay. And so, this is the way that it plays out. And sorry, I'm telling you all these stories, but another reason why to tell you all these stories is while we are in what is a bit of a limbo, to be honest with you. And I don't know how long that limbo will last, because I don't think we're going back to an all-out. But I don't think we'll necessarily get a resolution. But what it's telling you here is that we're getting a decentring of the region. And for the sake of this, we'll link Iran in the Middle East. And that is the other big development since you and I talked, is a defense pact, and not just, mutual cooperation, a full defense pact, which is if one of us gets attacked, we defend each other. And that's between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan.
Yeah, I was coming to that as well. Yeah, it's like it's called like I don't know if it's the official term, but the term that I've seen is like the Islamic NATO.
And they'll say, "Don't call us NATO. We stand for ourselves, right?" But I think they have a valid point in terms of making that. Let me explain why. And I think because although it is NATO's a mutual defense pact, so is this one. They are really emphasizing this is for Turkey, the Middle East, and if you want to call it Southwest Asia, right?
Mm.
Right? This is not about Europe. NATO covers Europe. We're covering this.
Of course, yeah.
And that's pretty pointed. Turkey still remains as a member of NATO. And that does provide a potential link between NATO and this. Let's call it and I think it was called the Mecca Accords or the Mecca Pact. So there's a potential link through that. But the Turks have wanted for years under President Erdogan to be a big player in the Middle East. Islamic country, right? Much more of an open Islamic system in terms of the way it preaches, promotes itself. We want to have more influence in the Middle East and indeed in Southwest and then extending into Central Asia. Think about their relationship with Azerbaijan, for example.
Yeah.
Then you've got the Saudis who come into it because Saudi Arabia wants to be a leader of the Middle East, right? And it's like, okay, where are they going next, given the instability that's been set off by this U.S.-Israel war? And then you have Pakistan, which always is measuring itself up against India, always recognizes that India is a much larger country, and is looking at its relations with folks in Asia, but how it can get backers up beyond that. And then behind all of this is China, because Pakistan has very good links with China. The question of Saudi's relationship with China is also in play here. And the thing about Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, what links all three of them is they are big-time recipients of American military weaponry, whether it's through grants or whether it's through sales. And in many respects, the U.S. has been sort of like, it's been like the number one power in the Middle East for decades because of the size of the American military, because of the size of the American military's weaponry programs, and because of, its political intervention. Now, that was kind of shaken by 2000. It was shaken in post-2003 in Iraq because that was such a failure. It was shaken post-2001 in Afghanistan in terms of the U.S. in Asia. But now you've had these shocks of the Trump folks, both Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, culminating in the war here. And these folks are saying, we're going to defend ourselves and we'll look elsewhere for who else we bring in. And we'll look elsewhere for who we work with. And the Trump folks better pay close attention to that. I mean, they really better pay close attention to that because this isn't a bluff. Turkey, it doesn't mean the Americans still don't have influence. I mean, Turkey, for example, has been for months trying to get approval for the F-35s, the advanced U.S. fighter jets.
Yes.
The Saudis know that U.S. kit, U.S. weaponry is probably at this point going to be better than Chinese weaponry. And their military is geared up towards that. So it's not like the U.S. is being completely expelled. But it means there's an awful lot of recalibration going on. And it doesn't mean that if Trump leads, other folks are going to follow. That's kind of out the door. I'm not sure. And again, I'm not sure the Trump folks have completely absorbed that. I honestly think there's a level of just lack of insight. Starting with the fact that on February 28th, they believed the Israelis when the Israelis told them that the Iranians were going to rise up and overthrow the regime once the supreme leader was killed. And continuing with the nonsense, because even though we can make fun of this and poke fun, there's part of things, do these guys really believe it? So if that energy secretary, Chris Wright, honestly says, does he believe they're getting 9 billion barrels of oil out? He's just simply deluded. Does Trump genuinely believe that they control the Strait of Hormuz? And watch this space. But I'd say, sorry, I've gone on and on and on. I'd say in terms of the next 2 weeks before we chat again, I'm watching for whether that Iran-Oman deal gets sealed and delivered. I'm then watching, if it does get sealed, how vocal are other powers coming out to support that deal and linking it to the need for the wider talks, and how much pressure does that put on the Americans? And meanwhile, I've got to watch Israel messing around in southern Lebanon, and I've got to watch the Houthis and whether they risk destabilizing everything by upping the ante with Saudi Arabia. My hunch is if we get an Iran-Oman deal, the Houthis will pull back. They do have considerations within the country.
Yeah.
But I get a hunch that both the Saudis and the Houthis will pull back at that point, because why should you escalate and threaten the deal over the Strait of Hormuz, which could unwind everything? But never predict, just simply look at the possibilities.
That's a very interesting point. And this actually reminds me of a point. I mean, we mentioned Steve Keen earlier, that he said that we're on the verge of World War III and we don't know it. Although we didn't delve into that for that discussion, because my priority was all about the economic side of things rather than the military side. I mean, that could be our future discussion. But I'm just thinking about this coalition, the Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Where does that leave Israel? Because there were murmurs that Israel was effectively thinking about Turkey. That they were trying to, Netanyahu was mentioning or alluding to this idea that Turkey is the new threat potentially for Israel. And that automatically made people think that, okay, these guys, Israel wants to attack Turkey, which of course they can't do because Turkey is part of NATO. But I'm just interested to what was the reaction, if any, from Israel and indeed, for example, United Arab Emirates, because of course they're not particularly super friendly with Saudi Arabia. I mean, did that ruffle any feathers, this coalition of those three countries?
Those great questions. First of all, just before this coalition was announced, Saudi and Saudi Arabia and the UAE said, "Live and let live." That the UAE has left OPEC. There was that idea they were drawing closer to the Israelis and the United States, but in fact, they publicly let it be known that they want to cool things off. Right? A lot of this came out of the personal relationship between the Saudi leader Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE effective leader Mohammed bin Zayed, because MBZ was effectively the mentor of MBS. It was the UAE leader that was a mentor because Mohammed bin Salman is a relatively young guy still.
Indeed, yes.
And then as Saudi Arabia starts to make its moves, as MBS is getting more and more confident, and especially because of the complicating factor of when Yemen went sour for both these countries. There was a rift between the UAE and Saudi that began to develop. Anyway, maybe a topic for another time, but right now, that split between UAE and Saudi has sort of been patched up to an extent.
Okay.
The interesting one is Israel. That's a really, really good point here. The Israelis are really worried about this, and you can tell they're worried about it. Now, they've got other priorities right now. Their priorities right now are what's happening regarding the U.S. and Iran and what's happening with Lebanon and Gaza. But the reason why they're worried about it is, first of all, there was a time a few years ago because the Turks really wanted a better relationship with Israel because Israel has leverage with its high-tech industries.
Indeed.
Including the military applications from it. And the Turks were like, well, okay, we could benefit out of this. There was also the question of what you were going to do with energy projects in the Mediterranean, where the Turks and the Israelis both had an interest. Gaza wrecked that. The Israelis isolated themselves a lot over the last few years, and this is a case of it, that when they went into mass killing into Gaza, Erdogan has pinned himself in being like the leader of the Muslim world.
Yes.
And there's no way that he could stick this, right? There's no way he could normalize with Israel. That's the position where we are now. The Saudis, of course, the big myth, and this is what I talk about the Trump folks in terms of do they believe this? Remember, it was only a few weeks ago where they kept saying, "Oh, we're gonna ceasefire here, and then we're gonna have normalization with Israel again. All the Arab countries are going to normalize with Israel." I'm like, like hell they are. The Saudis are not going to come back and normalize with Israel after Gaza and after this.
Yeah.
Well, now they've made that clear. Their priority is not normalizing with Israel; it's where they go with other countries. And then Pakistan's really interesting. Pakistan's interesting because India had drawn closer to Israel in recent years. Again,
Indeed.
the potential of high tech collaboration. India was really interested in that. The potential of other economic projects as well. So India was like, okay, we'll get in on this. And then, of course, that's all gone problematic for India because Trump has fouled things up with the tariffs. And now you get the war in Iran. So the idea of a Trump-Israel-India triangle, and it's like, okay, Pakistan kind of moves into this space here where that instability is, which is, all right, we'll go in with Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And remember, Pakistan can do this not by, quote, taking sides. That's the other way they benefit. I've got to say, not a huge fan of the Sharif government in Pakistan. The way it took power, I'm not a huge fan of the fact that I remember when the brother of the current prime minister walked away with billions of dollars from Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif. But in terms of the way they've played this, they position themselves as a mediator.
Yes.
Right? They're not taking one side or the other on the U.S.-Iran war, which has given them the space then to come into this Turkey and Saudi Arabia setup. And it'd be interesting to see if other countries come in closer. It'd be interesting to see if other Gulf countries come in. It will also be interesting because Turkey quite clearly made an overture to Egypt and told the Egyptians, why don't you come in on this? And if the Egyptians come in, think about the effect on Israel, right?
Exactly.
Egypt does have the peace accord with Israel, but still, you see this regional alignment, and the Israelis are the folks that are on the outside, which takes place. This completely goes against the Abraham Accords, which was the Trump 1.0 project, which was you bring Israel on the inside with all the agreements with the other countries. I don't know, the Trump folks may go back to it and try to play with it, but remember, the way that the Trump folks are pushing the Abraham Accords is against all these developments we're talking about is it's going to be son-in-law Jared Kushner and is going to come back in and revive all of this. And it highlights something, Tim, which the Trump folks play transactional politics, and they've made a lot of money off transactional politics, and they've gotten some short-term benefit off transactional politics, like the Abraham Accords. Interim one. The problem for transactional politics is when you get wider issues that go beyond transactional, which bring up geopolitical issues.
Yes.
And when you have geopolitical issues like this, you can't just play transactional politics. You have to have tactics and strategy which go beyond your immediate interest, right? In terms of medium to long-term relationships that you're going to be developed. And the Trump folks are not geared up for that. They simply are not. They honestly thought, I still think they honestly thought, and in fact, they still think they can go into Gaza and they can have these economic projects. They can have these condos. They can have this high-end property in the Israeli-controlled space of Gaza. And they could have those projects for resorts and golf courses up in the Gulf. And it's like, you think that's going to happen now? You still think that's going to happen after what you've done? In a reminder, the Trump folks have achieved all of this in less than, it's just over 18 months.
Yeah.
Just over 18 months that they have succeeded in undoing not only the geopolitical situation in there, they've undone all their investments in that area. But that day of reckoning won't come for them for some time yet.
Well, as I always like to tell my kids, that it's so much easier to destroy everything. It's a lot harder to rebuild. This is the end of part 1 of this discussion. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Make sure you tune in for part 2 this coming Thursday, because you do not want to miss what Scott had to say. Oh boy, he went on a rant. And I loved it. And I'm sure you guys are going to love it too. Now, before you switch away, please make sure that you've subscribed on YouTube and follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Make sure you give us a 5-star review or whatever review that you think is fair, because otherwise your following there does not count. And if you can afford it, please consider becoming a member at retortmedia.com/support. You get some really cool goodies. You get direct access to myself and some of our guests. But more importantly, you fund all of the operations that we do here in relation to our infrastructure, the data monitoring, news monitoring, to make sure that we stay on top of everything. Thank you so much, guys. Much love to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.
You are listening to CEO. Retort.